Well, thank you, President Dockery, so much for that very kind introduction. It's a real honor to get to be part of Trinity International University's Inauguration Week. You have so many fascinating speakers coming, Dr. Timothy George, Reverend John Perkins. But I should say that I come to you today not as a pastor or as an expositor of Scripture, but really as a fellow pilgrim, to offer a few thoughts on a big question that I think probably most of you in here have considered, and that is the idea of calling. What has God called me to be, and how do I understand, discern, and live out that summons on my life? Obviously, it is a big question, both for individuals and for a university to try to grapple with. And in many ways, you as students here at Trinity International University have a big leg up. You study at a school that takes the great question seriously, that takes spiritual reality seriously, that takes God's truth, God's character, and God's purposes very seriously, and takes community seriously. You are in a good place to grapple with those questions. But you're also at a pivotal point. For many of you, there are lots of choices, lots of challenges, and lots of distractions as you think through these issues. And adding to that complexity and anxiety, there are certainly different conceptions of what calling is, what it entails, and how it's realized. So today at Chapel, I just want to offer a few simple thoughts about the big question of calling in community. Its nature, the role of community, a historical example, and a personal illustration. In terms of what calling is, for a long time there have been many misconceptions that have floated around, and particularly in the Christian world. I grew up in a fairly fundamentalist Christian home, rolled off a mountain in New Mexico and found myself at Harvard, which was quite the culture shock, was involved with campus ministry there, and what little I'd heard about calling was at best inconsistent and often thoroughly confusing. I got involved with a campus ministry group, which was in many ways a fantastic group that has done extraordinary good, not only on U.S. campuses, but really around the world. But they had a notion of calling that was very much a two-tiered system. And that was the idea that full-time Christian service was always the highest and best call one could make on one's life. And everything else was clearly second rate. It could be used perhaps to use your job as a platform for evangelism. It could be used to funnel money to the people who were doing the really important stuff. But it was clearly second rate, second best. And if you happened to be a woman, you were barred from positions of leadership in this campus ministry. So if you had the gift of leadership, the idea was you'd better use it if you do it all in a place that's second rate. That, I think, is one misconception of what calling is. There's another misconception of calling, the idea that it is simply your vocational gifting. The job hunt is essentially the call. Go and find what you are called to do. But actually, in looking at the Bible, there's a very different conception of calling. In the Old Testament, to call means to name. And to name means to call into being or make, which is why God called the light day and the darkness night. And as such, the idea of calling assumes a caller, one who would name and call forth into being, which means that ultimately our identity and our vocation are ultimately grounded in relationship. And so our calling is to become who God called us, named us to be, and who he is making us into. Os Guinness put it this way in his excellent book, The Call, which I would recommend. Calling is the truth that God calls us to himself so decisively that everything we are, everything we do, and everything we have is invested with a special devotion and dynamism lived out in response to his summons and to his service. Now, there are many different implications of this, but I'll touch on just two. One, first, is that it all matters. Where you are, what you do, how you do it, where you go, who you live with, work with, worship with, relax with, your work, your place, your priorities, your habits, your possessions, your priorities, it all matters. It is all part of your calling and living into who God made you to be. But secondly, one of the most important implications of this is that calling, while personal, is not merely individual. But because it involves relationship, it involves others, and it involves community. And so understanding and discerning our calling becomes not just self-actualizing or being all that we can be, but necessarily involves building up a community of faith. Just a few minutes ago, we had Ephesians 4, 1 through 16 read to us. And I want to read just a couple of those verses again with a Message translation, because I think it sheds particular light on this. Paul said this, "In light of all this, here's what I want you to do. While I'm locked up here, a prisoner of the master, I want you to go out there and walk, better yet, run on the road God called you to travel. I don't want any of you around here sitting on your hands. I don't want anyone strolling off down the path that goes nowhere. And mark that you do this with humility and discipline, not in fits and starts, but steadily, pouring yourself out for each other in acts of love, and noticing differences and quick at mending fences. You are all called to travel on the same road and in the same direction, so stay together, both outwardly and inwardly. You have one master, one faith, one baptism, one God and Father of all, who rules over all, works through all, and is present in all. Everything you are and think and do is permeated with oneness. But that doesn't mean you should all look and speak and act the same. Out of the generosity of Christ, each of us is given his own gifts. He handed out gifts above and below, filled heaven with his gifts, filled earth with his gifts. He handed out the gifts of apostle, prophet, evangelist, and pastor-teacher to train Christ's followers in skilled servant work, working within Christ's body, the church, until we're all moving rhythmically and easily with each other, efficient and graceful in response to God's Son, full, mature adults, fully developed within and without, fully alive like Christ. Paradoxically, building up a community is often exactly what equips and enables us to better understand, grow into, and live out who God made us to be. It does this not only by providing an arena to both discover and to grow our own gifts, but also to enable others to do the same in a way where the whole becomes far greater than the sum of the parts. The ironic and happy news is that it's often in relationship with God and in community that we actually become more ourselves. Or as C.S. Lewis put it in Mere Christianity, the more we get what we now call ourselves out of the way and let him take us over, the more truly ourselves we become. But the more I resist him and try to live just on my own, the more I become dominated by my own heredity and upbringing and surroundings and natural desires. In fact, what I so proudly call myself becomes merely the meeting place for trains of events which I never started and which I can't stop. He continued, until you have given up yourself to him, you will not have a real self. Sameness is most to be found among the most natural of men, not among those who surrender to Christ. How monotonously alike all the great tyrants and conquerors have been, how gloriously different are the saints. Or as Oz put it again in The Call, the truth is not that God is finding a place for our gifts, but rather that God has created both us and our gifts for a place of his choosing, and we will only be ourselves when we are finally there. An echo, perhaps, of what the great St. Augustine said in referring to God when he said, "You have made us for yourself, and our hearts are restless until they find their rest in you." So what does all that mean? This sounds very theoretical, fairly highfalutin. I want to offer a good historical example. How many of you have heard of William Wilberforce? Excellent, a fair amount. It's been said that the actual proves the possible. I think it was Immanuel Kant who said that. And Wilberforce is an amazing real-life, if historical, example of what that looks like. For those of you who don't know the story, Wilberforce was born into a life of privilege, was exposed to evangelical Christianity at a fairly early age, kind of floated away from it, went off to Cambridge, had a grand old time. He was supposed to be a very witty conversationalist, interesting guy, had relatives die, leave him money. He was independently wealthy. Became buddies with William Pitt, who later became the prime minister while he was a student at Cambridge, and became an MP, a member of parliament, at the age of 21, where apparently he spent his time, because his seat was fairly safe, basically eating, drinking, carousing, and hanging out with the guys. And then around in his early 20s, around the age of 24, he had a spiritual reawakening and rededicated his life to God and began to think very seriously about what that meant for the rest of his life. He seriously considered whether he should just leave politics altogether, buying into one of the original misconceptions of calling that really the most important thing is always what's called full-time Christian service, and he thought very seriously about leaving Parliament and becoming a minister. And ironically, it was John Newton, the former slave trader, who wrote The Words to Amazing Grace, who convinced him not to stay exactly where he was and continue to think about and pray about what his calling would be. And in his mid-20s, he got down on his knees, prayed, and then wrote in his journal that he believed God had placed before him two great objects for the remainder of his life: the abolition of the slave trade and the reformation of manners or morals at the time. Now, that, we kind of think, oh, well, yeah, that happened. That at the time was the most audacious, astounding, incredible thing to tackle not one, but both of those. The slave trade was an enormous part of the economy of England at the time. And having worked for years in Congress, I can tell you that when any economic interest is threatened, there is a lot of time, effort, and money put into resisting those proposed changes. England at the time was one of the most violent, debauched, depraved, polarized, and unpleasant places to live. Right around the same time, as you know, we had the French Revolution. Part of what fueled the French Revolution was the incredible injustice that went on, the incredible violence and poverty, as well as just the economic inequality that went on. In France, around half of the GDP at the time went to Versailles, leaving only half to basically feed the rest of a starving populace. England was a fairly similar way. So for Wilberforce as a 20-something, to decide that God had placed before him the two objects of abolishing the slave trade, which was a huge part of the total GDP of England, and effecting a cultural revolution to essentially remoralize his country, was absolutely astounding. And yet, that is what happened. And how it happened is an amazing story. Wilberforce gets much of the credit. By the time he died, not only had the slave trade been abolished, but slavery in general among the United Kingdom had been abolished. Now, there are some people who might say, well, that was a historical inevitability. Perhaps. But of course, those of you who know your history know that it took us over here much longer and a civil war to get it done. In England, it happened decades earlier without a shot being fired, even though it meant giving up a huge amount of wealth in the country. And what had become one of the most violent, debauched, polarized, and economically unequal societies on earth gave way to Victorian England, which again has been criticized at times for being too repressed, but a little bit of sexual repression after decades of incredible violence on the street probably didn't feel so bad at the time. But there are many characteristics to the way that Wilberforce went about this, and one of the most important, and one that often gets very short shrift, is the role of community. Wilberforce played an incredible, pivotal role in history, but he did not do it alone, and he would never have succeeded if he operated alone. Around him was a group of friends, which became known as the Clapham Sect. And this group of people lived together in community, hung out together, brainstormed together, dreamed, schemed, planned, petitioned, politicked, and so on together. It was said of their group that it was a meeting that never ended. Now, some of you might think that sounds like hell on earth, But for these people, they both so enjoyed each other's company and were so caught up in a shared vision of human flourishing in the good that for decades they lived, worked, and breathed this together, and ultimately were witness to a historical anomaly and really a miracle. His friends, and it was really kind of a motley band of friends, a group of people. You had anti-slavery activists, you had Josiah Wedgwood, who was a potter at the time, you had a number of different women, Hannah More, Lady Margaret Middleton, Charles Middleton, just a group of people that were in many ways a fairly ragtag band. And each of these people contributed in really unusual and creative ways. Now, I've worked on a number of different political campaigns. I can assure you that when you're trying to get your group together to launch a campaign, you need your money guy, you need your communications person, you need your social media person, you need the grassroots director. No one looks around and says, where's the potter? Where's the painter? But the artist in this small group had an incredible effect. So Josiah Wedgwood actually commissioned a plate, a piece of pottery that had a picture of a slave on it with his hands clasped, and around it the words, "Am I not a man and a brother?" And Wilberforce and his friends decided this would be a fascinating way to basically help change the conversation, help persuade people, and open up a chance to get them thinking in a new way. And so Josiah Wedgwood released this plate, which wound up on the tables of many slaveholders across the country. And as they ate their dinner, they were literally confronted with a question that they may have wanted to avoid. And in Wilberforce and the Clapham Sect's ideas, this launched a conversation. Again, a hospitable way to invite people to consider questions they hadn't thought about and perhaps reach new conclusions than they had in the past. Members of the Clapham Sect were also utilized in really remarkable ways. We don't have a lot of information on Lady Margaret Middleton, but she is a fascinating person. At a time when, if you've read your Jane Austen, you know that women were not enfranchised, they could not own property, often it was entailed away from them. She had been disowned by her parents when she married Captain Charles Middleton, which puts a person in an incredibly economically vulnerable position. So she couldn't vote, she couldn't own property, she was disowned by her parents, but she was also apparently a really remarkable hostess, a very smart person, and an excellent writer and thinker. And at a time when there were very little venues for women's leadership or women's work, she actually had an incredible impact. Dr. Samuel Johnson, who was not known to throw away a compliment, once put in a letter that she was one of the wisest people he had ever met. And so she basically used her home as a salon to help instill and forestall different stories, different conversations, to help change people's mind, both about slavery and about a whole variety of social and moral issues. And so she used her salon to incredible effect, and also, according to some accounts, was one of the speechwriters as well as editors of many of the anti-slavery speeches that took place in Parliament. So this little community, comprised of seemingly ragtag people, had an incredible effect, and together, very creatively pioneered new forms of persuasion. I mentioned the launcher before. This was something that had never been done before. A really remarkable idea, and still one that is used today. Wilberforce and his crew also had a very interesting use of petitions. They actually started a petition and garnered 10% of the populace of England to sign this to encourage the abolition of the slave trade. Imagine trying to get 10% of the American population to sign a document. Hand sign, not just email it in. Incredible canvassing that they'd done, incredible tactics, and so on. But some of their most interesting work came not just about the abolition of the slave trade, but the reformation of manners and morals. And by the time of Wilberforce's death, there were over 69 different measures that had been passed to basically, in small ways, start chipping away at the pathology that they had seen in society and try to set up both structures, incentives, and the like to encourage more human flourishing, more freedom, and more justice. They did this in a variety of ways. They looked for some of the most egregious examples of injustice and went about starting there, what we would now call a political wedge issue. And they made gradual progress. One of the things that happened at the time was the use of underage chimney boys who would clean the chimneys of different people around London and the like. It was very difficult work. It was dirty work, dangerous, and often there were a great many young boys who were injured or even killed this way. This is one of the first things that they started on, efforts to reform that particular unjust practice. They also found out that there was an annual proclamation society where King George issued some kind of proclamation for the promotion of good and virtue and the suppression of evil, which was usually just ignored. It was kind of an upper crust thing to belong to where rich people could join it, reassure themselves of their own virtue, slap each other on the back, and go off. And so they thought, this is an interesting tactic to use. Let's really reinvigorate this. And so they took this club and actually strengthened it to the point where it did become both a volunteer center and a real place where suddenly goodness, in their words, became fashionable. They passed different measures to prevent the cruelty to animals, child labor laws, the abolition of the lottery, the reform of public drunkenness laws, different criminal statutes, abolished different unjust practices in paupers' prisons, founded the Royal Institute for Science and the National Gallery, and so on. 69 different initiatives just in a couple of decades. It's also interesting to see how they worked, in that everything they did was characterized by good cheer and hospitality, also quite unusual in politics. Wilberforce worked constantly across party lines. He mended fences whenever he could. When he learned about the plight of the widow of an influential leader who he had been always greatly at odds with, he and two friends arranged for a lifetime annuity for her. He was a person of humor, curiosity, and humility. One of his contemporaries, a radical Scotsman named Sir James Mackintosh, with whom he was always at odds, wrote this about him, which I thought was so interesting. If I were called upon to describe Wilberforce in one word, I would say he was the most amusable man I ever met in my life. Instead of having to think of what subjects will interest him, it is perfectly impossible to hit on one that does not. I never saw anyone who touched life at so many points. And it's most remarkable in a man who's supposed to have his life absorbed in the contemplation of a future state. When he was in the House of Commons, he seemed to have the freshest mind of any man there. There was always the charm of youth about him. I think this is a remarkable testimony to a man embroiled in some of the most difficult, viciously opposed battles of the day, who was constantly thwarted, undermined, and sabotaged with everything he tried to do. And yet, one of those saboteurs would describe him in this way. Wilberforce's life is a remarkable testament to the idea that one person living a life of radical obedience out of love to him who called him can change the world, but also that he cannot do it alone. Without Wilberforce, the slave trade would not have been abolished the way it was, or when it was. But without the Clapham Group, Wilberforce would have lacked the encouragement, the moral support, the financial backing, the social network, the communications base, the foot soldiers, and the intellectual resources, all of which were vitally necessary for the task. The Clapham Group not only helped Wilberforce realize his calling and stay faithful to it and achieve it, they were part and parcel of it. So you might say, okay, that was over 200 years ago. What does that mean today? And this is not nearly as exciting as an example. But one thing, I just wanted to share a personal illustration in that about a dozen years ago or so, as a member of Senate staff, there were a small group of us who were Christians who would meet together occasionally and discuss the Bible, ideas, ways to work together. And we felt like we discovered Wilberforce, kind of before he was cool. And it kind of invigorated the imagination. And so we'd sort of start out as a reading group. First we read books. We quickly devolved down to articles, discovered Wilberforce and thought, maybe there's something here. And not only his approach was brilliant and in many ways timeless, but also the way he thought about his work, his vocation, and his call is something that perhaps we should think quite seriously about, not only individually, but also in community. And so we started doing that, meeting together, brainstorming together, and praying together about what that might mean. And it's been said that life is lived forward but only understood backwards. At the time, it didn't seem like it made a great narrative, but looking back, there were several very interesting things that came out of this ragtag little group of House and Senate staffers meeting occasionally to pray and talk about Wilberforce. So it evolved into something more. One of the first questions we kind of engaged was, how do we basically promote the kind of conversations that can help change culture? All of us working in the Senate and the House became more and more aware that law can only do so much, that in many ways culture is upstream from politics. Law is a teacher as well, and there are times it's more of a whirlpool than a simple stream, but in many ways culture is upstream. And so a law that basically goes against that at some point is going to be overturned. And we started thinking about, in our own capacities, what impact can we have in terms of culture changing? And so several things came out of that. One, because one of our bosses was in leadership at the time, we were able to start a Senate leadership working group on compassion and culture. And many of us in it convinced our own bosses to come and brainstorm with us. We invited thinkers and scholars to meet with us and our bosses on ways of discouraging violent, debased entertainment, decreasing the demand for abortion, framing the debate on faith-based charities, and the like. The bonds formed as part of this group helped forge relationships between our bosses, who began to work together in more ways. And several interesting things happened. One of them is that part of those discussions were one of the many things that helped inspire Senator Santorum to introduce his partial birth abortion bill. Just like Wilberforce found his wedge issue with the chimney boys something so egregious that it really helped raise the larger question about child labor, here was a practice that was so egregious that it was a good thing to basically launch a larger conversation. And so Senator Santorum introduced a bill in Congress to abolish just the practice of partial birth abortion. Now, it should be said that that practice alone did not account for a huge number of abortions at that time. And there were some people who thought it was the wrong way to go about things, that you're not tackling the big issue. But his thought, based somewhat on these discussions, was that this is a great way to get a conversation going. And so he brought up the bill, and there was debate on it, and it was heated, and the bill failed. And so he started bringing it up year after year. And for a couple of years, the bill failed, and the conversation was heated. But it did open a conversation. And one very interesting thing happened. By the time the bill to prohibit the egregious practice of partial birth abortion was passed, the total number of abortions in the country had fallen by more than the total number of partial birth abortions. Now, there may well have been other factors at play there. I can't say it was a straight line in terms of causality. But one thing about introducing the conversation, exposing the injustice, and leaving space for people to be challenged and possibly change their minds had an impact. And it had an impact even before a bill was passed. Another thing that came out of that is we began to think very seriously together about, is there a way that we can discourage violent and debased entertainment? Now, this is an area where you can't really tackle it legislatively. Not only does that run into whole problems with freedom of speech, but also politically it's just, it's dead on arrival. But we've started thinking, are there ways to basically raise a conversation about what's going on with really violent and debased entertainment? And one Halloween, probably about 12 years ago or so, perhaps a little bit more, I had several little trick-or-treaters show up to my house, and there was only one costume that was repeated. And I must have had 6 different tiny kids show up dressed like the murderer from the movie Scream. Some of you might remember this movie. It was like one of the teen slasher movies in like the mid and late 90s. It was a rated R movie, which meant that people over 17 weren't supposed to be able to see it. I remember thinking, this is interesting. At the time, all the litigation about Joe Camel, cigarette smoking being marketed to underage kids was going on. And I remember thinking, this makes Joe Camel look subtle. Here's the costume for the murder. It's supposed to be a rated R movie. Kids under 17 aren't supposed to be able to see it. I have a 4-year-old showing up at my door dressed this way. And so we started thinking about, is there a way to basically look at the marketing practices of hyper-violent sexualized entertainment and who it's actually being marketed to? So our bosses discussed it. My boss at the time decided to lead it, Senator Brownback. He went to Senator McCain, who was the chairman of the Commerce Committee, and said, can we have a hearing? McCain said, sure, knock yourself out, whatever. It probably wouldn't have been that big a deal. It was scheduled for 6 months ahead of time. And then 2 weeks before the hearing happened, Columbine happened. And suddenly, this became a very big deal. And what would have been a very short hearing with very little attention suddenly became a marathon 9-hour hearing that was on front pages, across the country. And several things came out of that hearing, but again, it was never a straight line, and a community was involved. As legislation often happens, one of the things that came out of that was an amendment to look into, basically ask for a Federal Trade Commission report into whether adult-rated entertainment products were being target marketed to underage kids. The amendment passed overwhelmingly, was attached to a bill that was defeated, so it went nowhere. President Clinton decided this is actually a good idea. He issued an executive order to have that Federal Trade Commission report come out. Over a year later, it did. The report found that 70% of R-rated movies, 80% of M-rated video games, and 100% of music with a parental advisory sticker on it was in fact target marketed to kids. It was a bad day for the entertainment companies, but they probably would have just brazened it out and not done much, except that a Christian billionaire who owns about 1/3 of all the movie theaters in the country saw that report and the coverage on it and decided that he would start thinking more seriously about his own vocation and what he was called to do. And so in his movie theaters, he started enforcing the R rating. Well, what happens when suddenly 1/3 of the movie theaters in the country start enforcing that R rating is that the movies that were not just target marketed to kids, but tailor-made for kids, which is what many of the most sexualized, most violent, most debased movies were. Teen idols as stars set in high schools and the like. 30-year-olds aren't watching this. It's all teenagers. Suddenly, those movies became unprofitable. Whereas R-rated movies that actually were target marketed to adults, your Bravehearts, your Schindler's List, what have you, weren't affected at all. And so fast forward 12 or 13 years, well, it's hard to say that our culture is now awash in truth, beauty, goodness, and flourishing. One thing you can say is that you rarely see a teen slasher film anymore. And part of the reason for that small little change is that a whole variety of people, both working individually and trying to live out God's call in their life, and working in community to brainstorm and scheme together, have an impact, even if just a small one. So I offer that just as a personal illustration of the idea that in so many ways, our friends and our community are essential to really enabling us to achieve the call and the claims that are placed on our life. It may be one of the great paradoxes of the Christian life that God equips us and strengthens us, largely through others, so that we can do great things in Him and for Him, but often only with the help of friends, family, worship, the fabric of community. It's both humbling and exciting to realize that much of what we were called or even commanded to do, we cannot do alone. And so as you continue, while your years here at Trinity, to think through God's call on your life, what He is calling you to be, naming you to be, and pulling you into, I just want to leave you with a few words of encouragement. One, that he has promised that he will never leave you nor forsake you. And secondly, that he has placed you in a community to love, work, and worship together in order to better get to know him and his call.